Kia ora, ko Stephen Clarke toko ingoa. Yep, I'm currently an independent consultant working in information management and AI, but I'm about to announce actually next week a new role, which gives me more of a global reach and allows me to do the stuff that I'm really interested in, because the sort of things I'll be talking about today, I'm not seeing a lot of it happen in Aotearoa, New Zealand, which is challenging. And of course, within our profession, no one really wants to be left behind. And as we see the rest of the world progressing, it's kind of frustrating that we're not doing as much as we could in New Zealand, and I'm allowed to say that because I'm not a public servant anymore. It's frustrating to see to see our government not investing in this as other countries have. I'll start by saying I've only really got half an hour, and I'm going to only do about 20 minutes, so there's time for questions. So what I did was I did a big research report back in 2021 on the use of AI and machine learning across the archives globally, and I refreshed it in 2023, and it's been kind of I've been augmenting it within the context of working with international standards, ISO, the international standards body. And I think what's interesting from an archival practice perspective is that in the Anglophone countries, we have quite a hard kind of division between what we consider what's records and information management and what's archives management. Well, that's quite an Anglophone thing. In most countries around the world, they don't have that division. They see it more as an end-to-end continuum. I mean, I could give examples like in France, for example, the Archives Nationales has, a couple of people embedded in every government agency, and their sole job is just to work with those agencies to make sure the standards are adhered to for information management, and that facilitate the transfers of archival material from the agency into the French National Digital Archive. Denmark's got a similar kind of process. They've got a slightly different model, but it gives roughly the same effect in a place like South Korea as well, and increasingly in China. China is by far and away, in my view, the global lead in AI and information management, way ahead of anyone else, and no matter what the Americans might tell you, and that'll be pertinent for what I come on to. So I just thought a little bit of context. I'm going to read it out with the numbers. You can read them for yourself. But I think what's amazing is that 90% of all the world's information has been created in the last 4 years. So that puts into some sort of context. And I remember, I don't have the numbers in front of me, but I remember reading that if you took a byte of information and you took it to a gigabyte, I think that kind of fills up so if 1 gig of information was a grain of rice, and you take that up to a gig, I think that fills like a swimming pool. But when you get to a zettabyte would be the equivalent of rice for the entire Pacific Ocean. So that gives you a kind of context of the size of the issue and how much information is. And if you look at, we're talking about multiple zettabytes now. So as I say, in 2021, Europeana did a survey of what was happening, and it showed that even then, 90% of organisations were doing stuff in machine learning, AI, call it what you will. I know it's kind of sexier to call it AI now, but what most people are actually really doing is machine learning. But I think I thought about updating this presentation, and annoyingly, just this morning, I see that ARXIV has just released their global survey on archives and libraries for AI usage. And I guess the point of this is it tells its own story that even in 2 years and 3 years, how much the world has changed. And the stuff I'll be talking about is mainly machine learning. And but most of the underlying stuff from archival science that we do and that we're really good at, like ontology, for example. I remember doing ontologies back in the 90s with card indexes. That was how it was done. And if you look back at the original ontology in Australasia, which gave rise to the record series, which is what Archives New Zealand uses and most of the Australian archives, they did the original ontology, and you can go and look it up in the Commonwealth Record Office, and I think it's online through their archives, it's digitised. It's from 1953, and their ontology is just drawn out on a page. And you think, 25 years ago when I was doing this, the ontologies that we were doing were card indexes because the technologies didn't exist to do it digitally then. And now, there's free tools. You can go out and play with it on your own. So, even 4 or 5 years ago, most organizations were doing something in this space. And for me, I'm coming at this from a standards perspective, and I know a lot of people think standards are kind of boring and they get in the way of doing stuff, but the two examples I give in the standards world is that the introduction of the shipping container, the standard, and global trade went up 830% in 7 years. It enabled globalization, it enabled the entry of the Asian countries into the global economy. And if anybody's going to tell me that globalization and the mushroom of global trade was an impediment to innovation, I'm going to argue against it. The other example I would give is the internet. It's standardized up the wazoo, everything from your W3C standards to your Wi-Fi standards and everything in between, and all the packaging and da-da-da-da-da. Standardized up the wazoo. And again, if you're going to argue that the internet is an impediment to innovation, good on you, but I wouldn't agree. And because AI has been recognized globally as being an existential threat to humanity, for the very first time in history, we have genuine global standards. So I've been involved with ISO and doing standards at the Australasian level for almost 20 years. And what you find is that ISO standards tend to be patchy in their pickup. You've got NIST and IEC in America that tend to do their own thing. You've got the Chinese standards body that tends to do its own thing. The EU picks and chooses. So that standards aren't genuinely global, although they claim to be international standards. They're international in the sense that they're intended to be international, but they tend to be not genuinely global. They tend to be localized. And there's kind of three key kind of global economic entities of the US, China, and the EU. But there's a global approach now. There's a committee called SC42, Subcommittee 42, and that's in liaison with JTC1, which is Joint Technical Committee. And what it means is that the JTC1 bit came out of the US, and the SC bit came out of ISO. And what they've done is, what they've said is, all the standards bodies, if a standard's released under and the AI is part of the 42,000 series, it's a genuine global standard. What it means is that the US and China and the EU will adopt it, and ISO kind of covers everywhere else. So that's kind of cool. So there's lots and lots of frameworks out there. I'm not going to go into them. There's plenty of reports on this you can Google. And I'm not going to read out any of these standards either, but really what I just wanted was, I'm going to flick through just to kind of give a... So if you saw all those slides and all the standards, this is slightly out of date because it keeps changing, but there was roughly, when I last looked, and I did a proper look about a year ago, there was 55 published standards for AI. But who I'm working with is ISO TC46, SC11, and they're the Technical Committee for Records and Archives. They also include information centres, publishing archives, records management, museum documentation, etc. And as I say, that's why I started off by saying, although you might think, well, it's a records management standard, how's that relevant to the GLAM sector? Most of the world doesn't make this distinction. And the reality is, if you're not capturing records of things right now in live environments in the AI episteme, you've got no chance, it's gone. We're no longer in a position where the archival context starts at 7 or 15 or 25 years. It starts within milliseconds now. So if we are going to try and capture authoritative records and archives and a long-term history of our culture and our practice, we're going to have to do it in advance of the creation of records, not wait until after they've been done. We've got to get ahead of the game, because if we don't capture these the records and how things are done, it's too late. Most systems now overwrite, and there's no standards in place for how records should be kept. And the big rush to AI, who's keeping really great records of their training data, of the machine learning algorithmic training, the iterations that go through, the tweaking of the F1 and other checks and balances, and how large language models are created, for example. Now, you've got to get ahead of the game and make sure that stuff is captured live, because if you don't, you've lost it. So I think what's kind of interesting, I've seen it grow as well. I think that whole globalization of genuine globalization of the standards bodies means that now, for example, China and the US are all over, and it was difficult to get them involved sort of 10, 15 years ago in any meaningful context. So if we look at the organizations that are involved, and the particular subcommittee that I'm particularly interested, which is records management for artificial intelligence, there are 35 participating countries and 16 observers. So there's 50 countries involved in developing this. And the difference, it doesn't actually make a huge difference. All that being a participating country means is that you can ballot, because the way international standards work is the countries vote on them. And if they don't like them, they vote against them. And that's why you've got to get consensus and work together. Which through the process, you don't suddenly put something out and it gets voted down. You have to work together really closely to make sure that right from the very beginning, that you've got good alignment, and you're going to get your, I think you've got to get a minimum of 66 countries voting, 66% of countries voting yes, and no more than 33% of countries voting against. I know that sounds tautological with the numbers, but you can have abstentions, so it's kind of slightly more complex than that. So currently within that committee, probably the best known standard is 15489 for records management, but they also do the standards for archives and records metadata, which is 2381. And anyway, there's about 20 standards that have been published in the Records and Archives Committee, and we've kind of categorised them. So one of the things we did was we looked at all the standards that we had, we categorised them, and we thematically took the key concepts so we could start to map them, because what we'd found was that these, over time, the original standard was was 2001, 15489, it kind of grown organically, and the standards hadn't really been strategically developed. And I've got a quote here. So, for artificial intelligence and automated decision making in particular to have any hope of being ethical, repeatable, transparent, explainable, governed, trustworthy and/or accountable, we need to maintain full and accurate records of the source, training data, inputs, processes and outcomes. Otherwise, we just have to take it on trust, which I'm not sure we're ready for yet. Which is me quoting myself from the plenary where I presented on this in Berlin last year. And I should probably stop quoting myself in presentations, which is my quote from right now. I couldn't find one. I couldn't find one that really fitted my purpose, so I had used my own. But at least I've referenced it. Yeah. But the key issue here is that no one in the AI industry is doing this. They don't care about long-term accountability and transparency and openness, because it's a cash grab, it's a money grab right now. So if we don't do this, no one else is. And that's the really cool thing, is that we were going to do this as a TC46 SC11 standard. And what we realised is if we did that, it would never get the traction that it would be if it became part of that SC42, because if it's part of the SC42 suite, it becomes global and it genuinely gets uptaken. And that's the really exciting thing, is that we are now working liaison with the SC42. So when this is published, it should become the global standard. And SC42, who do all those other standards, most of them are coming out of the US and China. And they recognised, I presented at a plenary about three months ago. It was a global plenary, and the Americans and the Chinese and Australians and Netherlands and 12 different countries were presenting on this. And what came out really clearly was that there was a recognition within the AI industry that they are not doing this. And it's all well and great putting these standards out for trustworthiness of AI and accountability and openness, but if you're not keeping records, it's on trust. So there was a recognition that we do need to have a dedicated records and information management standard for AI in order for us as an, the existential threat of humanity to be mitigated, and the use and misuse of these technologies and platforms for, with and against humanity. If we don't keep records of this and we don't monitor this, no one else is going to do it. And if we don't have standards for doing it, how else are we going to give effect to the necessity to keeping records for accountability, trustworthy, mitigation against bias, and all those other things that we need to do? So there's 4 areas that, when I was speaking to this group, that I raised. So again, I'm sort of quoting myself to an extent. But Australia and New Zealand are actually quite a strong voice in this, which I think is really interesting. And I think it's partly driven by the fact that we have different drivers in other countries with bicultural expectations about how information is managed, and that, other than maybe Canada and Sweden, Finland, a few other places, Indigenous record keeping is not considered to be a strong driver, and yet those communities have been on the crappy end of the stick of information and records management for the last 200 years, and I've got the greatest insight into how we mitigate the risk against humanity than anyone. So I think that's a real driver in how we should be thinking about information and records management for all humanity, not just for those worst affected of colonialism and the colonial adventure within information and records management. And all the practice, everybody in this room derives their mandate and legitimacy from records, archives, libraries. All that European and colonial practice is still inherent. So we have to think about this in a different way. And I think AI gives us an opportunity to do that, because it is a game changer, and we don't have to drag the baggage of the last 200 years with us into this environment. So how do we use records management to implement AI, which is how do we create records and make sure that there's good records and accountability within AI processes? And of course there's an intersectional relationship that once you're using AI to do museums, archives, records, you need to keep records of how you've done that. So there's an interrelationship between the two, and the distinctions matter. Because there are two different things, and I feel this is my own personal view. There's a risk for this committee and the standard we produce to become confused by trying to do two things in the same standard. My own personal view is we should do two different standards, but anyway, I just thought I'd raise that consideration because it is two different things. And we're not always, I know it's a bit tautological, but I think we become, in the GLAM sector, we can be quite navel-gazing and not always recognise that we're part of a global context and have that position to play globally, not just within our own profession, but how we can be leaders for everybody else. So we did a review, as I said before, of what was out there. And look, all the good stuff's already been mined. So the biggest barrier to having good GenAI is the fact that there's very poor records and data out there, because we haven't got good quality information and data, because we haven't got good practice. In the last 30 years, partly that's our own fault, adhering to a paper paradigm. Even when we try and do digital, we try and recreate the paper paradigm in digital form, rather than doing digital native standards and practice and approaches. And that's on us. So we work at I should have said before, the Chinese are the secretariat for this group. They're leading the development of the standard. And my colleague Zhao Mian, who's professor at Renmin University, and I think she's got seats in MIT and a couple of European universities as well. But anyway, she's a bit of a powerhouse in this, and she's got an army of PhD students that can go and do all this cool research for us. So we looked at what was out there. So if we looked at those 55 standards, and we gave them codes, So I don't have a lot of time to go through this, but you can read it for yourself. So what we did was we looked at all the things that were mentioned. So we had our 20 standards, and we broke up information records management into a bunch of key areas, and that's the codes on the A side. And then we looked at all the standards that were out there and the things that they mentioned, and that's the code on the other side. So we looked at all the standards out there that mentioned things that we thought really were information and records management, but they didn't actually give any real guidance on how to do it within the existing AI standards. We looked at our standards and we mapped those two things together. And we said, well, actually, now we've linked those two things. That's a clear roadmap for how we then develop the new standard. And it's Otto von Bismarck said that laws are like sausages. It's best not how to see how they're made. But this is a little bit of an insight into how standards are created. They're not just kind of made up. There's quite a lot of work that goes into understanding them. So yeah, we looked at all the things that were in our standards. We looked at all the things that were in the AI standards. Well, actually, let's bring them together and do something it's like one standard to rule them all for AI that connects the two different cohorts of standards. So we create a rationale for that, and I'm really short on time, so I'm going to kind of whiz through. And this is how the sausage is made. So this is how that's how the new standard will be structured. And these slides will be made available, so you can look through this yourself. This is just a bit of an introduction to them, really. That's how the existing standards bodies look. So again, there's very little. There's been a history of patch protection, and everybody tried to do their own bit. And what we're trying to do is, and I think that's what's really exciting about JTC 1SC42, is we're trying to bring it all together into one global set and try to get rid of some of the overlaps. We've got to do the entire life cycle is such 1940s thinking, right? And, it's like by the 1990s we've got the continuum model, because digital meant, in fact electronic meant that those paper paradigms I spoke about of Brooks, Philip Coolidge Brooks' life cycle model published in American Archivist in 1940. Life cycle model was dead as soon as we got electronic records in the 90s. And of course Frank Upward brought out the continuum model, and by the 90s we realised that those paper paradigms were not fit for purpose in the electronic digital environment, and yet still people talking about life cycle. In the 21st century, that 1940s thinking, it's not how records work anymore. They move back and forwards, they're not linear. They don't get born, march through life and then die. They're constantly recontextualized, reused in new contexts, overwritten, new metadata, new context, new use cases. So we start to think of it. So it's not really life cycle, but that's my own little personal battle. I'm probably not going to have time to go through in the case studies. But there's the ones that I've pulled together and looked at. So the archives one, was my baby and with Joshua and others when that was at archives first time around. So doing AI before it was cool back in 2020, 2021. So the US ancestry one's kind of interesting actually, and there's a whole bunch there from Australia. I thought I'd pick out some local ones. So I'm not going to go through this, but what you'll see is that I've pulled together a pretty robust set of use cases. And one I might actually just very, very quickly look at is Ancestry.com, US Census 1940-1950 case study. So they did from handwriting recognition and then feature extraction from that. You can see the different codes are all different features. They didn't use an LLM, this was just pure brute force machine learning. They ran the software, curated the results, did the human in the loop oversight and trained the machines. And what they found was that in the 1940 census, 132 million names, took 6 months to create an index. Once they trained the machines to do it, 151 million names, 9 days. And that was about 3-4 years ago, so imagine what you can do now. Xero does something very similar if you ever use that kind of software to do receipts. You'll see that since I actually wrote this a few months ago, you'll see the kind of trend at the moment for fake receipts. It's kind of a thing, along with giving up amazing amounts of your own personal data to get a picture of yourself as a toy in a box and things that people do, which is great. I'm not not giving them my data, but if you want to do it, good on you. Yeah, so sorry, I've kind of tried to pack a lot in, but what I was going to get at really was that there's 100 slides here. It's a fairly complete use case analysis of global use of AI within the archive's context. Read and enjoy. I'll not go any further and invite questions if you've got time.
Unfortunately, we don't actually have time for questions, but Stephen has generously offered to provide the slides afterwards, so that way you can peruse them, and I'm sure he'd be happy to have people get in contact. So thank you very much, Stephen.